Hi kids, Pastor Josh here again, and I've got a good story for you. Now, our story tonight is called The Last Supper. Now, the reason it's called that is because it's the last meal that Jesus had with his disciples before he was crucified. Now, we're not going to go into the crucifixion today. Stay tuned on Sunday for that. But the story tonight is definitely important. Now, our story actually begins outside of Jerusalem again. After Jesus and his disciples had been talking for a little bit, Jesus turns to two of them and says, "Go into town, find a man carrying a jug of water. Follow him, and when he enters a home, enter that home, and ask the guy who owns the house, 'Where's the room where the master can observe the Passover feast?'" So the disciples do exactly as Jesus says, and everything goes exactly as he says. They go to that guy, and he shows them to a room just upstairs. And it's exactly what they need, and it's already set and ready to go. So later that night, the disciples and Jesus all go to that upper room to celebrate the Passover feast, the biggest holiday of the year for the Jews. Now, it's been a long day, it's been a hot day, the disciples are exhausted, they're ready to eat, but the big thing to note right now is that their feet are a mess. You see, back then, they didn't have tennis shoes. All they had were sandals. And all they had to walk on were dirt roads. So you can imagine their feet were pretty dirty. Especially when you take into the fact that animals used those roads too. Their feet would have been a mess. Now, the way things usually worked back then is before people sat down to eat, a servant would come in and wash everybody's feet because of how messy they were. Now, this was not a job that anybody wanted. Usually, if you were the guy in charge of washing people's feet, it meant you were you basically had the worst possible job. So, imagine the disciples' amazement when Jesus takes off his outer cloak, wraps a towel around his waist, and then one by one goes around with a tub of water and some soap and washes the disciples' feet. Jesus is their teacher. He's more important than them in their eyes. And yet he's taking the job of someone lower than them. They have no idea what to make of this. And Peter says as much. He says, "Master, you're too important to be washing my feet." But Jesus says, "Don't worry, Peter. I want to do this. And if I don't wash your feet, you have no part in me." So Peter pipes up and lets Jesus wash his feet. And then after Jesus has gone around and cleaned everybody's feet, as he's putting his cloak back on, he tells them, "No man is greater than his master. I'm your master, and here I am serving you. If you want to be like me, then you need to do the same and serve others." After that, they all sat around the table getting ready to eat. But at this point, everyone can tell that Jesus is a little upset. But they have no idea why. And then Jesus says, "One of you is going to betray me." The disciples are floored when they hear this. I mean, they're Jesus' most loyal followers. And one of them is going to betray him? Now, admittingly, at the time, they think this just means that one of them has let Jesus down in some way. They don't realize how bad the situation is. Because you see, one of the disciples has actually agreed to turn Jesus over to his enemies. The guy's name is Judas. Now, the tragedy here is that Judas was probably one of the most trusted of Jesus' disciples. He's the guy that the group trusted with all their traveling money. What the disciples didn't realize, though, is that Judas, every so often, would take some of the money for himself. And so that's what happens here. Judas actually went to the Pharisees. They went he went to Jesus' enemies and offered to give him over to them in exchange for money. And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. That might sound like a lot, but the fact is, if Judas had gone and worked on a farm for about a month, he'd have earned the same amount. This was not a lot of money, and yet he still agreed to betray Jesus for it. And now back to our story. One by one, the disciples ask Jesus if they're the one that he's talking about when he says someone's going to betray him. Finally, Jesus takes a piece of bread and says, "The one I give this to is the one who's going to betray me." And he gives the bread to Judas. Now at first Judas tries to deny it, but Jesus just says to him, "Judas, go do what you need to do." So Judas gets up and goes out. And the disciples still don't get what's going on. They just assume that since Judas is the guy in charge of the money, he's going off to take care of an errand for them. Now at this point, Jesus sits back down, takes some more bread, gives thanks, meaning he prays over it, and then he breaks it into pieces and gives those pieces to the disciples. And then he says, "This is my body, broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then after they've all eaten the bread and after they've eaten supper, Jesus takes a cup of wine, blesses it too, and then he passes that around saying, "This is my blood poured out for you. Drink this in remembrance of me." The disciples honestly don't get what's going on. But this was Jesus' way of telling them it was almost time for him to go away for a while, for him to die. But he wanted them to remember what he was going to do by this meal. And so after the bread and the wine, Jesus sat and talked with his disciples for a little bit, trying to teach them just a little bit more, get them ready for what was going to be coming up. Then, and I think he did this part for us as much as for them, he sang a song with his disciples. Then he and them went outside to pray. Now the rest of the story we'll cover on Sunday, and I hope you turn in because it's going to be a good one. The greatest story. But we need to focus on the lessons of tonight's story real quick. First, when Jesus washed his disciples' feet. As followers of Christ, one of the things we try to do is follow Jesus' example. And Jesus himself told his disciples, if you want to be like me, then you have to serve others. So I'm sure many of you do want to try to follow Jesus' example. So here's a little challenge to help you with that. Every day this week, I want you to find a way to help somebody else. Talk to your parents about this. I'm sure they're more than willing to help you figure this stuff out. But at least once every day, find one way that you can help your parents or somebody else around you. And then the second lesson is what Jesus did for us. We don't see his sacrifice in this story tonight, but we see Jesus setting something up to help us remember and celebrate his sacrifice. I mean, when we eat bread and drink juice in church, we call that communion. It's to help us remember that Jesus paid the price for our sins, for all the bad stuff that we've ever done, even though he's never done anything wrong. So when we eat the bread and drink the juice in church, it's to help us remember that he has saved us from our sins. And while it might be sad that what Jesus had to do that, it's also worth celebrating. That's why he sang with his disciples before they went out. So remember, kids, even though parts of the Easter story might be a little sad, we have reason to celebrate because Jesus went through all of that to save us.